Hey YouTube, having a good weekend? Excellent. Today I'm going to be reviewing a documentary by a man named Tim Mahoney, and this documentary is called Patterns of Evidence: The Exodus. With a name like Patterns of Evidence: The Exodus, you probably have figured out, or at least come to the conclusion of what the topic is, namely discussing the historicity of the Exodus account in the Bible. We all know the story, how Moses led the people out of Egypt after sending plagues, after God sent plagues there, led them to the promised land, conquered it. We all know the story. But today, most scholars would say the story's a bunch of baloney. Basically, that's what it amounts to them. And our man here, Tim Mahoney, he was a Christian all his life. And when he heard this, however, he was very stunned. It shook him to his core. I mean, after all, the truth of the Exodus is confirmed all throughout the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, and confirmed by Jesus himself repeatedly. Jesus goes to Moses countless times. And yet if the Exodus didn't happen, then the foundations of the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, and even to an extent the Muslim faith, it's just a bunch of hogwash if the Exodus isn't there. And so Tim Mahoney goes to Egypt and Israel and all throughout the Middle East, interviewing scholar after scholar to see if he can find out the truth. I found it interesting how from the very beginning Tim Mahoney went to this questioning his own beliefs. That's a sign of a good scholarly mind, even if the man's a filmmaker. Tim Mahoney interviewed dozens of scholars just before making this movie. Only about 1 dozen actually made the final cut. But they include some scholars who didn't believe the Exodus at all, and they got a good voice in this movie. And even they are enough to, cut you to the core, Then, however, he did interview several scholars who did believe in the Exodus, or at least believed that what most of the Bible said about it was true. Some of the anti-Exodus people included a couple of Israeli archaeologists, Israel Finkelstein and Norma Franklin, both of whom don't believe in the Exodus, and from the Ryden Museum, a Martin Raven. Now, among those who did believe were particularly prevalent was a man by the name of David Roll. We'll get to him in a minute. Also Charles Ayling, John Benson, Brightwood, many others. And they even had one who was almost neutral on the subject, I thought, Mansour Barayak. Anyway, all these people, basically he interviews all these guys and they give their positions on the Exodus. And basically what we're finding out is there's no evidence for the Exodus in the time period that everyone's looking. And that time period is based on a verse in the Bible which says, and they went to build Python and Ramesses. Alright, Ramesses II built the city of Ramesses. And we know when that is, and heck, there's no evidence for an people of the Exodus there. But then this man named David Roll, who is actually an agnostic, looks underneath Ramesses, and due to the work of an archaeologist named Betek, who by the way is against the Exodus, but he looks at Betek's work and sees, but wait a minute, underneath the city of Ramesses we're finding this city called Avaris, and Avaris was populated by Semites. It's in the exact location, it's right where it should be. The only question is the name, and then we see, but wait a minute, the land of Ramesses was used in the book of Genesis, referring to Egypt itself, meaning that obviously by the time the book of Genesis was compiled, using Ramesses to refer to places that to times when Ramesses hadn't even been born yet. When Joseph went to the land of Ramesses, obviously it had to be before the Exodus. Obviously it had to be before Ramesses at any event. And yet it's the land of Ramesses. Basically what we figure out is that this is an anachronism, a word put in by later scholars to describe something, to translate something basically, so that people of a new generation would understand. So Ramesses would have been called Avaris to the people of Moses' age. This is at least what David Roll claims. Now, at that point, it might say, this just seems sketchy. And it is kind of sketchy. However, he goes on to explain by looking at the events recorded in Exodus and Genesis, how the city of Avaris gives truth to every one of those events, from the arrival of Joseph into Egypt. They find Semite families living there, living in good wealth, prosperity, growing and multiplying, and they even found evidence of Joseph himself, which you've got to see that, by the way. Look it up, David Roll and Joseph, very interesting stuff. Then they find out evidence for these very prosperous, special free city Semites all of a sudden going into deep poverty, depression, and even perhaps enslavement. And that's the third stage. So the arrival, growth and multiplication, enslavement, evidence for all these. And for enslavement, we even have evident textual evidence of Hebrew slaves in lists of Egyptian slaves. So it's very interesting, very interesting. Then finally, we see evidence of great troubles on Egypt during the period, and then the complete evacuation of all these Semites from Egypt. And then it's at this point, this Avaris date, this older date, it fits in perfectly with the times that the Canaanite cities actually were destroyed. Because the scholars say, well, obviously Joshua didn't conquer Jericho, because these cities, they were destroyed, but they were destroyed long before Joshua. And yet, under this scheme, if we begin with the beginning of arrival at Avaris of these Semites, we find that it matches perfectly in time with the destruction of Canaanite cities. And so we have a family of Semites arriving, growing and multiplying, being reduced to hard conditions, very likely slavery, evidence for them leaving Egypt rapidly without looking the other way, evidence for destruction, utter destruction of Canaanite cities. Is it perfect evidence? No. Is it everything? No. Do we have very much textual evidence? Not much. We have a little. And the majority of scholars don't go for it. Nevertheless, it is good evidence. It's evidence that the stories of the Bible are not baseless, that they could be based on history. And I will say that it will probably, A, cause people who are already of faith to have less doubt, and B, it will cause people who do not have much faith at all to wonder perhaps if some of these stories at least have validity to them. Will it convert people? Probably not. And I will note that they did not find evidence so far of the great supernatural occurrences, particularly that of the opening of the Red Sea or evidence for Mount Sinai. They have not discovered things for that yet. And the documentary does mention that, well, a lot of things we didn't find stuff for that. Now, that is the critique, or the synopsis. Now for my critique. It was one of the most balanced documentaries I've ever seen in my life. Both sides were brought in. We heard a ton from anti-Exodus people. In fact, other than David Roll, the agnostic, I think we heard more anti-Exodus people speak than pro-Exodus people during the whole documentary. And these are very intelligent people, too. So it's one of the most balanced documentaries I have ever seen in my life. It's well made. And when you follow Tim Mahoney, his own struggles, his own feelings, you're like, oh, I can relate with you, man. It's so realistic. If I was giving stars, I would have to give this review 5 out of 5 stars. I honestly can't see any flaws. If I gave it one exception, I suppose it's that they focused a bit too much on David Roll, who is only one scholar. And even among the pro-Exodus people, he does things that some of them are questioning. Nevertheless, overall, it's one of the most balanced I've ever seen, one of the most well-made. It's very well-made, both profound and yet easy to understand. It's amazing. You need to check it out. Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus by Tim Mahoney. Get it on Amazon, get it anywhere. Great, great movie. It's worth your time. If you have questions about the Exodus, either questions about your faith or questions about a faith you don't believe in if you're a secular already, it'll open your mind. It'll take you places where you've never been before. I highly recommend it. God bless and see you guys, alright?